Hey, how's it going everyone? I'm Mike Pointer and I've been covering 4th generation consoles lately in this series of Retro Tech Tricks videos, so I thought it was about time I gave handheld gaming some love. The first ever portable gaming handheld I owned was the Atari Lynx, and despite its lack of success against the likes of the Sega Game Gear and especially the Nintendo Game Boy, I think it's the most interesting of the three in regards to how it actually worked. So let's dive in and take a closer look at Atari's underdog handheld that was perhaps gone way too soon. So the Atari Lynx was released in 1989, the same year as the Game Boy and a year before the Game Gear. I'm not going to dive deeply into the history, as that's not the purpose of this video, but I will at least mention here that the concept was originally done by a company called Epix, some of whom were responsible for conceiving the Amiga. It was called the Handy Project at the time, but when Epix sold it to Atari, it was rebranded to the Lynx. It was arguably the most powerful of these 4th generation portable systems, boasting a backlit full-colour screen, the first handheld to do so, a fast 8-bit CPU and a 16-bit GPU. It's one of the only gaming platforms that supported a left-handed mode, having 2 sets of action buttons and being able to flip the screen 180 degrees so the unit can be turned the other way around. The original unit was a chunky beast, being even bigger than a Nintendo Switch with the Joy-Cons attached, but with a much smaller screen. Even the redesigned Lynx Model 2 was still roughly Switch-sized. If you ever owned one of these, you'd likely remember that it chewed through batteries at breakneck speeds. It needed 6 AA's and they only lasted about 2 to 3 hours. Mind you, a lot of this was due to the backlit screen. The original model had a brightness adjuster dial, and the Model 2 included the ability to switch the backlight off, which increased the battery life to about 5 hours. However, it wasn't like the Game Boy, you couldn't really see the screen without it on, so it was really only used if you needed to pause a game and wanted to save some battery life. Regardless, most of the time you'd probably have it plugged into a power adapter, which kinda ruined the portability a bit. Aside from the backlight button and the slightly smaller and more efficient design, the only other advantage the Lynx 2 had over the original model was stereo sound when using headphones. The Lynx had 2 custom processing chips, nicknamed Mikey and Susie. No, I don't know the story behind those names. It might have had something to do with the chip's designers or some other employees at Atari or Epix, but that's only a guess. If anyone actually knows the reason, feel free to drop a comment. On the original model Lynx, these were positioned under an RF shield on the same side as the cartridge slot. And on the Model 2, they were positioned under an RF shield in the middle of the board under the screen. Mikey contained an 8-bit 65CO2 as the main CPU, clocked at 4 MHz. This chip, or one of its variants, was used in a lot of computers and consoles at the time, from the Apple II, Commodore 64 and BBC Micro, to the TurboGrafx 16, Nintendo Entertainment System, and most of Atari's earlier products. Mikey also contained the unit's 4-channel sound chip and video driver for the display, as well as being responsible for handling the game loading, the Comlinks feature, and some other functions. Susie was clocked at a blazingly fast 16 MHz and acted basically as the device's GPU, containing the main graphics engine, which I'll expand on in a moment, a blitter and a maths coprocessor. She was also responsible for handling the joystick and button inputs. The Lynx had 64 kilobytes of RAM on board, split into 2 32 kilobyte modules. The cartridges, or game cards as they were called, in theory could be up to 2 megabytes or 16 megabits in size, but the largest commercial games only reached 512 kilobytes or 4 megabits, with the majority being 128 kilobytes or 1 megabit in size. It was the world's first full-colour handheld, being able to display 16 colours at once per scan line, organised on just one single palette from a total of 4,096. Its resolution was one downside though, being 160 by 102 in comparison to both the Game Boy and the Game Gear that ran at 160 by 144 resolution. It did however have a 3.5 inch screen, which was larger than both of its competitors. I mentioned right at the start of the video that it was pretty interesting in how it worked, because unlike the Game Boy and the Game Gear, which were more traditional tile-based platforms, the Lynx was actually more like the Neo Geo and constructed all of its graphics out of sprites. So yeah, everything you see on the screen on the Lynx, from the backgrounds to the HUD to the player and the enemies, are all made up of sprites. Unlike its competitors, there also wasn't actually a hard limit on how many sprites it could draw at once either, although obviously there was only so much you could throw at it before it started affecting performance. Sprites could also be any size. As a result of everything being sprites, sprites were also how the collision was handled, and there were actually 8 different types of sprites which had different combinations of properties of being collidable, non-collidable, visible and invisible depending on what was needed. Suzy was quite powerful in the fact that she could manipulate sprites in ways that not even the major consoles could do at the time. Firstly, sprites could be scaled, both smaller and larger. Battle Wheels here showcases the feature quite nicely. This is something that not even the Neo Geo could do. In that case, it could make them smaller and restore them back to their original size, but couldn't actually make them larger. The Lynx could do both of these easily, being able to scale sprites up to 256 times smaller or 256 times larger on the horizontal axis, vertical axis, or both. Many games took advantage of this feature, but some, like Electrocop, actually built their core gameplay around it, with the whole environment scaling as you move around it. It didn't end there though. Sprites could also be stretched, tilted, and flipped, both horizontally and vertically. This was all kinda nuts coming from a handheld that, remember, was released in 1989. All of these effects were put to good use in a lot of games. A good example of a game that uses this is Zybots, where the walls are constructed of sprites that are stretched, tilted and flipped in various orientations. It makes good use of the scaling as well, and it runs at a pretty good clip as it's actually not needing to render too much to the screen to be able to do this. The priority of the sprites was determined by what order they were drawn on the screen, with the last ones drawn having the highest priority. But in order to do this, and what was pretty unique for gaming systems at the time, even the major consoles, the Lynx used a double buffering system. Essentially, it would display one frame on screen while the contents of the next frame is drawn to a buffer, and we can see it gradually building the scene out of sprites in this inactive buffer using debug tools, going from the back to the front. Once it's complete, the display swaps which screen is displayed, and the cycle repeats. In another example, we can see that even though sprites can be any size, sometimes larger objects were made up of a number of smaller sprites. As you might expect though, it takes a while to draw all of the sprites that make up a single frame, so as a result, very few, if any, commercial games actually run at a full 60 frames per second. Despite this, it had a number of quite remarkable arcade ports that were more faithful to the original than many other home versions. Pit Fighter usually doesn't get a whole lot of love these days, and for good reason because it's not particularly good, especially the infamously bad Super Nintendo version, but the Lynx version is a notable achievement, both from a technical point of view, but also a playability point of view. It's reasonably accurate to the arcade, with nice sprite scaling as characters move closer or further away. Hydra is a fantastic port of the arcade game, and is perhaps the best home version of it, as the other versions, which were all on various computers, just couldn't pull off the scaling convincingly. Same story with Road Blasters. The Lynx port is excellent, and looks and plays amazing. Stun Runner is perhaps the best of the lot. While a notable downgrade from the arcade because it's not true 3D, none of the other home ports got even close to looking, running, or heck, even sounding as good as this version does. That's not to say that it wasn't capable of pushing polygons though, as this setup did actually allow it to do so at a somewhat playable frame rate, demonstrated here by hard driving, and was able to do a better job at it than many other consoles could manage at the time. While it's definitely not smooth, the fact that it was even possible at all is pretty impressive. Once again, looking at some debug tools, we can see it constructing each frame sprite by sprite in the buffer, which takes longer to do when working with polygons, but the hardware gets it done just fast enough to get away with it. Battlezone 2000 is a pretty interesting case. On its surface, it appears to be a port of the vector-based Battlezone arcade game from 1980, and to be honest, it's actually a very good port, maybe even the best home version of the game. It runs well, it plays well, it looks authentic, supports up to 4 players, and adds extra features. On its own, this will already be pretty impressive. but there's actually an entire extra game contained on the cartridge. This is a completely reimagined and more modern take on the game, ditching the wireframe style and using solid filled polygons for the enemies while rendering the rest of the environment with 2D scaling. As a result, the frame rate here is much better in comparison to something like Hard Drivin', which renders the entire game in 3D. There's hundreds of levels with various different types of terrain and enemies, and the gameplay is also way more complex. As the story goes, this was actually supposed to be the main game. This is the true Battlezone 2000. But the higher ups at Atari felt like it was too complicated and not what fans wanted, so they made the developers do a simpler wireframe style conversion of the arcade game. But the real Battlezone 2000 is still on the cartridge. They managed to squeeze it on there somehow, despite only being a 2 megabit ROM, and is only accessible by using a specific button combination. On the tank setup screen, press option 1 twice, then press it a third time and hold it, then press pause. This will reset the game and you'll then be playing the new version. If you own this game but never knew this, give it a try, but I will warn you it's pretty complicated and there's no manuals or documentation for it either. It's a shame that this needed to only be included behind a hidden cheat code, as it's fully complete and there was clearly a lot of work put into it, but at least it's there. While not arcade conversions, the ports it received of games like Shadow of the Beast and Ninja Gaiden 3 are also particularly noteworthy. Shadow of the Beast has a number of cool graphical tricks going on, notably how it pulls off some really impressive parallax scrolling with multiple background layers. It also manages to push more than 16 colours onto the screen by using raster effects to create a gradient in the background colour used for the sky and the outdoor levels. It also doesn't waste the opportunity to show some scaling when entering interiors either. Ninja Gaiden 3 somehow packs the entire Nintendo version onto the Lynx, with only the resolution and a few minor details really taking a hit. It looks and plays extremely faithfully, and it even includes all the cutscenes. It does this by shipping on a 4 megabit cartridge, which was the biggest they got back then, even though they were capable of being larger, one of only a handful of games to do so. Not all of its games were ports though, it had its fair share of original games too. We've seen a couple already, like Electro Cop and Battle Wheels, but Blue Lightning is definitely worth a mention, being an on-rail shooter with fast-paced aerial combat. It makes good use of the hardware to show the enemy planes zipping back and forth all the time, and provides a great sense of speed. If scrolling shoot 'em ups are more your thing, Zal Mercenary is an awesome original game for the Lynx. It doesn't do anything too noteworthy in terms of fancy effects, but it does look great with nicely detailed backgrounds, and there can be quite a lot happening on the screen, with enemies and projectile shots and explosions all going on. Impressively, the game maintains a solid frame rate despite all that's happening, without any hint of slowdown. Gordo 106 wasn't a particularly good platformer to play, but it does showcase some nice parallax effects that demonstrates what the hardware can do. Gauntlet: The Third Encounter was not a port of the original Gauntlet, and instead was a completely new game developed exclusively for the Lynx, being an arcade-style dungeon crawling RPG that was also one of only a few games that played in Tate mode by turning the unit 90 degrees. You might have noticed a pattern here. Only a few games did this, only a few games did that. Unfortunately, missed potential is kind of a common theme when it comes to the Lynx. There were only around 70 commercial games ever released for it, with another 40 that were confirmed to be in development but canned. The silver lining though is that it has a pretty active homebrew community that's still releasing games, and there's even been a few physical releases too. Quite a few of these unlicensed games were released around the turn of the century, only a few years after the Lynx was discontinued, and a handful of them have been made available on the Evercade. While the exact sales numbers are unknown, it's estimated to have sold somewhere between 1 and 3 million, and even if we're being generous and say that it was in the upper end of that range, it still wasn't even a third of the Sega Game Gear's 10.6 million sales, never mind even being a blip on the radar of the Nintendo Game Boy that sold almost 119 million. Still, being my first handheld system way back when I was in junior high school, I have a soft spot for it, as it was part of my early teenage years, and maybe you do too. I'll leave this video on that note. Feel free to drop some comments below with your own Atari Lynx stories and what you thought of it in general. Give me a thumbs up if you like this video, it really helps a lot, and don't forget to subscribe to stay up to date with my content. Thanks for watching and see you next time.
You